Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition is a role-playing game, which means that you play a role. There's a world, presumably, with history and people and things going on in it. And the character that a player plays comes from this world. They're not spontaneously created out of the blue from nothingness. The idea is that the character that a player plays in D&D had a life before they took up adventuring, and this is in the player's handbook, which is the rules if you're not familiar, and it's in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is the rules if you're not familiar. When you play the role of a character in a fantasy world for Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, or probably just about any other role-playing game, or TTRPG, that stands for tabletop role-playing game, you're playing what's supposed to be a person or a character. Now, writing advice I've seen says that characters aren't people, which I'm not going to get into because I don't understand it, although writing is a new hobby of mine. But as a dungeon master, I'll sometimes put some work in to prepare people for the world. Not the player characters, but people that the player characters would interact with. NPCs, non-playable characters. Here's some characters I prepared for one of my sessions. Sidon Wrightingham, a 47-year-old male human warlock with bald head and green eyes. He's so-and-so tall, and he owns a box of dead animals, and he's married to Anne Wrightingham. Anne Wrightingham is 35 years old. She's got brown eyes, and she goes to church to pick up sex partners, and she's married to Sidon Wrightingham. And she's having an affair with Oliver Darkdraft. Oliver Darkdraft is 5'5", so he's shorter than either of the Anne or Sidon Wrightingham, and he has a perpetual milk mustache. Isn't that great? So I prepared these three characters. I prepare characters for other scenes, other sessions. These characters were for a scene I had planned in the session that I played recently. If I just flip these pages here, I prep some stuff. When a player shows up to a table for a tabletop role-playing game, the player brings their player sheet, they bring their character that they're going to roleplay in their head, they bring their memories of the previous sessions, they bring their memories of what they talked about with the other players, but basically, when the players are not playing a tabletop role-playing game, the game doesn't take up their thought process. Like maybe, if you have a player that's thinks they're about to get some cool item or weapon, a magic sword. They think maybe they're going to get a magic sword the next session. Then throughout the time between the two sessions, that player in real life, while they're at their job or at home or whatever, they might think, oh, I can't wait for next session when I'm going to get that magic sword. But that's all they're going to think about. The referee, the game master, the dungeon master, they have to plan that out. They have to come up with a story. You don't just hand people stuff without effort. That's not how games work. If that's what people did, people wouldn't want to play games. Games are artificial challenges. We sit down. In Magic the Gathering, there's this thing called the Gentleman's Agreement, where you both implicitly agree that when you sit down to play some cards, you're not going to flip the table over and bend each other's cards in half. If you start losing, you're not going to stand up and slap your opponent and storm out of the room in a huff. These are all things that are in the Gentleman's Agreement. And if you just do an internet search for the Gentleman's Agreement card games, you'll find there's this thing called the Gentleman's Agreement. Well, when it comes to role-playing games, there's an agreement that the players will play a role, and though the players might not know this, there's an agreement that the referee, the game master, the dungeon master, they're going to come prepared. They're going to have a world they made, they're going to have stories they've thought up, they're going to have characters that they're going to act as, they're going to have cities and dungeons and roads and forests and buildings and temples and magic and spells and traps and intrigue and plot twists and ups and downs and story beats and themes and everything you can think of, and magic items. The magic sword that didn't just come from somewhere. The dungeon master, the referee, the game master, they had to decide, hey, what's the right magic sword that I would have this player possibly acquire, and what would the player have to do to acquire it? Probably go through some trials and tribulations like a dungeon, or do something for a mafia boss and get a reward. They have to come up with all of that, and all of that takes creative energy and time and effort. It takes skill. It takes so much skill. The amount that I have researched and studied running games at this point, it's crazy. It's nuts. And there's so much to learn. It's an art. I'm an engineer for making money, and when you're engineering, it's an art, because you always have to balance between getting the job done right, getting the job done on time, doing the job well enough that you know in the future you're not going to be repairing leaky pipes with duct tape, so to speak. But if you build a bulletproof pipe for the plumbing system, so to speak, then would that take too much time? And then you don't have enough time to do other projects. So engineering in general is an art between, you have a limited amount of time, you have a limited amount of resources, time is a resource, you have a limited amount of resources and you have too many problems to solve. How do you best pick the problems to solve and best spend the resources you have to solve the most problems the most adequate way, so that you can overall do the most good with the resources you have? Maybe they teach this in school. I don't really think they really teach this in school. It's an art. There's no hard and fast rule. Do you do really well at one thing and mediocre at the others? Do you do mediocre at everything, accepting that they're all going to need upkeep and maintenance in the future? I'm digressing because I'm talking about engineering, but being a referee, game master, dungeon master, you're engineering a good time for your players. You're an entertainer. You're a performer. You're coming to this event, the game, where everyone agrees that they're going to show up and do what they're supposed to do. And players don't have to do that much. But the game master has to do so much. They have to think about, hey, I've got 3 players. I've got 4 players. This player likes this. This player likes that. I know that these 2 players don't get along well in these sorts of situations. I know that this player has said multiple times they're really looking forward to that, or this player says they really like it when this happens. You have to take all of this into consideration, and then you have to think about, what's the story? What's the plot? And you have to take everything about your players into consideration, everything about the mannerisms, the way that they act, things that they like. And players might tell you that they like this or they like that, but they might be full of it, because you actually have to use your eyes and ears and your brain and observe your players. When are they paying attention? When are they tuning out? When are they interacting and engaged? When are they looking out the window at the clouds and trees? When are they getting upset? When are they having a good time? The players won't tell you this. They will show it to you through their actions. So as the game master, while you're putting on all of this show, carrying this fantastical plot that you're thinking about throughout the weeks in between the game sessions, and you're making sure you hit all these points, and you have all of these NPCs prepared that you're going to role play, and the scenery and the sights and the locations. If the players say they want to travel over there, you have to do the math to figure out how long does it take to travel and what could possibly happen. You have to have systems to adjudicate all of these things, and a lot of these things don't actually have rules in the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide, which is why I've purchased the Old School Essentials rulebook. That has some rules for things the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide doesn't have rules for, like reaction rules and wandering monsters. The 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide glosses over wandering monsters. I'm sure they mention encounter tables somewhere, but I don't actually remember reading about encounter tables in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I mean, they have some encounter tables in the back, maybe, but they don't really go through like making your own encounter tables. Old School Essentials has their own version of encounter tables. You have to go online and figure out how people have been doing encounter tables for the last 40 years. The Dungeon Master's Guide doesn't talk about mixing 2 dice together to make a probabilistic distribution curve so that you can give a theme to your encounter tables. They just use like roll a d12, not roll 2d6 and add it. That makes a probabilistic distribution. There's no systems in there. There's a system I found recently called the tension dice, which is used in a lot of games where you use dice strategically to artificially create tension. This is something that I've struggled with ever since I picked up this game, 3 or 4 years ago. I always wondered, how do I actually create tension? What's stopping the players from just taking everything slow and easy and never having a hard time? Because if there's no challenge, the players don't have fun. One of the ways you make it a challenge is you add constraints and stress, like a time limit, a resource limit. If you don't save the princess in 3 days, she's gonna die. If you don't get out of the dungeon in 6 hours, you're gonna suffocate. If you don't find the cure in a month, the mushrooms are gonna explode from your guts and you're gonna turn into a giant mushroom. You know, artificial constraints, tension, how do you do it? So the Dungeon Master's Guide doesn't really talk about it. Old School Essentials has some systems built in that sort of create tension. In fact, they totally create tension. The Wandering Monsters system in Old School Essentials, which is the same as like Basic, Expert, B/X for short, they have things that like implicitly create tension. But I looked on the internet and there's actual systems that are literally called tension dice system, a way to add tension using dice. And when I say tension, I mean like the players are trepidatiously going around the corner, they're cautiously peeking through the corridor, they're worried that their torch is gonna go out before they can get out of the cavern, like tension, right? It adds a feeling of atmosphere and emotions to the game. It gets people into the mood so they can role play, you know? That kind of thing is not talked about really much in the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide. I mean, yeah, it talks about themes, but it doesn't really give you tools how to do this. Because something I've discovered is that I feel like the people who published it, they kind of just assume that their players have been playing this stuff forever. Or maybe they just assume that when someone picks the book up and reads it from cover to cover, they're just going to be able to run a great game. Oh, maybe not. But I'm getting off topic. The point is, I'm trying to demonstrate to you that I've put in a lot of work to discover how to be a better game creator, game runner, dungeon master, game master. It takes a lot of effort. And so that brings me to the whole thing I was talking about at the start, role-playing game. When the players show up, they play a role. The role is a human, a creature, a person, a sentient being that is tied to the world that the story takes place in. They're not just playing some, avatar that spontaneously appeared in the world. So for example, a person that's existed in a world probably cares about children getting killed and would probably do something to stop children from getting killed, unless it was going to cost them their own life. And even then, a lot of people, there's stories of people jumping in front of buses to save kids, So there's an expectation when players sit down to play Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, there's an expectation that the players are supposed to be heroic adventurers who will more likely than not put their neck out there when they don't have to for people, possibly with no promise of a reward. In real life, we know people aren't always like this. People are more careful with their lives. They're risk averse. But in Dungeons and Dragons, the assumption is that the players are generally good and generally selfless and generous with their efforts and their time. They want to go around helping generally. In the Dungeon Master's Guide, I think it says players should not play evil alignments, and probably not chaotic, but definitely not evil. Which, by the way, that's funny as well. The Dungeon Master's Guide, maybe it talks about the alignments, but evil isn't actually bad per se. It's just selfish. So that's really helped me start role-playing more monstrous things like goblins and dragons and things. Just because it says it's evil doesn't mean that it gets its rocks off by torturing people. It could just mean that it's a hoarder and it's selfish and it doesn't care about others, which if you think about it, a lot of people are like that. I mean, I'm not saying I'm a paragon of selflessness. I'm not going to say I'm evil either, but so there's this assumption that players are going to play a role that is grounded in the fictional world. And whether the players know it or not, the game master does a lot of work to create this world. And the players won't think about the game when they're not playing it generally, but the game master has to put in some time to prepare. Now, there's lots of resources and forum posts and YouTube videos and podcasts and I don't know what, blog posts and books talking about ways to have less prep time, get your preparation done faster. And I've read and listened to a lot of these things, and it's helped me for sure. But you always have to prepare somewhat. And if you don't prepare, your players will notice. Players like a story. Players like being taken for a ride. Players like funny jokes inserted here, mysterious mystery inserted there. And maybe if you're someone who reads a lot, then you've read so much or watched a lot of TV. Maybe it's so inculcated into your pastimes that you can just, at the drop of a hat, come up with intriguing mysteries and thrilling horrors and adventurous daring deeds. I can't. You know what I do with my free time? I'm at the gym lifting weights, or running, or baking, or hanging out with people, or playing board games, or going to a club. Whatever my freaking hobbies are, I don't like sitting still. I don't like sitting still at home. I don't read a lot. It's funny, I actually do read a lot, but the books that I read, for some reason, I just can't like bring them into my worlds. And I actually literally do. Like in one game I have, the innkeeper for the inn is straight up a character I just ripped from one of my favorite stories. In another game world I have, the Pantheon of Gods, they're all characters from one of my favorite stories. I remember one time in one game I played, I got my players to run a quest for a guy. The guy was straight up a dude I pulled from a story, and he was, like, if any of the players had read the book, they'd immediately be like, oh, this is so-and-so from the story, and I'd be like, you got me. But the books I read are so obscure that I've only ever met like 2 people ever, one in real life and one on the internet, that have read the books I've read. So it's like, I don't know. But the point is it takes me work to prepare for these games. And when I say it takes me work, I mean 2 weeks before a game, because right now I think I'm doing a game every 2 weeks or so. You know, I might put in like, it's hard to quantify how much time I actually put in, because on my phone, I have a note. And whenever I come up with an idea, I just put it in my note. And I showed it to some DMs at a TTRPG convention the other day, and they said, oh yeah, you're a real DM. I'm like, thank you. And I have a whole stack of books. Sometimes I'll read through them to get ideas. I have a huge digital note app where I have pages and pages of documents linked to each other, interlinked with tags and internal links, images, hyperlinks to the internet, research I do, lists, tables, notes, character profiles, encounter descriptions, hex map coordinate mappings. Like, I mean, I'm probably putting in at least 10 hours for this game that these players are playing in like every 2 weeks or so. It's really hard to quantify, but I sit down and write on my iPad, which is like my laptop basically, for at least probably 4 hours a week. I mean, the day of the game, I get up, I eat, and before the game starts, I'm just prepping. I'm fleshing out characters. I'm writing encounters. I'm devising probabilistic encounter tables. I'm picking up things from the previous sessions and creating clues for things relating to them to go to the next session. And I'm record keeping a timeline. If the players did this and they slept a night and they did that and they slept another night and then they went there and they slept another night, well, now 3 days went by and I have to think, hey, for the person running the inn, for the bad guy over here, for the bad guy over there, for the dragon on the mountain, for the goblin tribe, for the sawmill with the saw workers, what did all of them do for the last 4 or 5 days? And what would be going on with them now when the next session happens? The players are not doing any of this stuff. But all of these things that I'm talking about are things that experienced game masters probably have done and do. And if you are one, you'll be listening to me right now and you'll be saying, oh yeah, I've done all the things that this guy's talking about. Probably more than this guy's talking about, because I'm very inexperienced. I've only been doing this for a few years now. A lot of these guys have been running games for like 30 years. It's crazy. They're like, oh yeah, I started playing first edition when I was like 10 years old. I'm like, guy, I started playing when I was 30. Like, I don't have all this wealth of experience. So it's frustrating. It's frustrating when I go to all of this work to create a story that I know the players like, because they keep showing up to my games and they say, oh, that was great, I loved that. Oh, I really like what we're doing right now. I mean, they literally tell me that they like it, right? They like the work I'm doing, because they might not realize that they're saying, oh, I like the work that you're doing. They say, I like the story, but the story is a product of the work that I put in. So when I create a situation for the players, I'm expecting them to be generally good, generally selfless, generally willing to put their neck out there. I'm not expecting them to just murder someone I put in front of them, the murder hobo, so to speak. Yeah, I guess I'm running into that problem that everyone complains about on the D&D forums, the murder hobo problem. What do you do when your players can just solve everything by killing everyone? Well, I'll tell you what, there's two approaches, okay, that I see. So one, I just let them kill them, and then I just stop putting in any effort. And then, everyone they come across, they just kill them, or they rob them, or they take their stuff. And I predict that they will eventually lose interest in the game, and then we won't have a game anymore. Because they're not, I'm just going to be winging it, because anything I prepare, they're just going to destroy. And they say they like the story, so how are they going to like it when there's no more story? I don't know what I don't know, and maybe they will like it. And I will say that I've certainly improvised a lot of stuff. And the story that we have today is wildly outside the scope of anything I imagined when I first sat down to make the story. Yes, I know that tabletop role-playing games are not writing your own book. I, as the DM, am not sitting down and writing a book where I know what's going to happen and this has to happen and that has to happen. No, I know that I only just have a role, and the players, they're the ones that basically create the story. But I can't show up to a session without any preparation at all. I have to predict some things that they're going to do. There is a degree of railroading going on here. It's not all railroaded, but if you philosophically think about it, if you don't prepare anything at all, the situation, the experience just sucks. So, you have to come up with systems and ways to both prepare things and not prepare things. You have to anticipate that things are going to go in a way you didn't expect. And so the story isn't going to go in the way that I expect. But at the same time, I have to have some kind of story for the players or they're not going to have a good time. And so when I put little bits of my story in front of the players, I'm hoping that they'll interact with it in a sensible way that a player and a character in the world would sensibly act. Not just murder the NPC straight up without interacting with it at all. It's ridiculous. And so all this is to say that they say, or people imagine that, oh, if you're playing a tabletop role-playing game, then you can do anything you want. You can throw an egg at a wall. You can steal from the shopkeeper. You can attack the bandit. You can try to scale the wall with your lasso rope. Sure, yeah, that is the spirit of the game. But when you just indiscriminately attack someone that's obviously not meant to be a threat, that if you stopped and thought about it for a minute and you thought, oh, hey, the game master probably put some prep into this. There's probably something here for me. It's not just like a random. I didn't just roll a 12-sided dice and say, oh, I rolled an 8. Looks like it's goblins. You have to. The game master has to have a good time too. It's not all just about the players. The whole experience must be a good time for the players. If it's not a good time for the players, they won't want to play, and then you don't have a game. But the game master has to have a good time too. For two reasons, at least. One, the game master's hanging out with the players. They're all in the room together. The game master's there too. Okay, so one, the game master's there too. The game master's a player too, in a sense. Two, the game master put in a ton of work to put this all together. So they better darn be getting something out of it. Like a good time. Now, part of that good time is just having a good time with your friends, wherever the story goes. But the game master's invested in the story, probably more so than anyone else. And so I let the players do things that I don't expect, and I let the players go left when I expect them to go right. But this last session, when my player just went to go just attack and kill these NPCs that I very carefully set up and introduced and all that stuff, I just told the player, I said, you can't. I won't let you. I literally said, I won't let you do that. And I don't know what your opinion is, dear audience viewer, but in all the research I've done, listening to all these gurus talk about running tabletop role-playing games, yes, generally speaking, you are supposed to just let the players do the thing. And if you looked at all of the game time that I've had with my players, I do generally just let them do whatever the heck they want, even if it's silly, even if it might break things, not go the way I wanted. But you're allowed to say no. You're allowed to shut the player down. You can straight up tell the player, that ain't flying. And in my personal opinion, what better situation to fly that flag and put the foot down when the player does not come to the table fulfilling their end of the gentleman's agreement. It's not literally the gentleman's agreement from the card game that I told you about at the start, but it's the agreement that the player is, generally speaking, playing a heroic, do-gooding, put their neck out on the line for other people without promise of reward character in an adventurous, high fantasy, low fantasy, whatever setting. And that their character is a actual person or creature in the world and has ties to the world. And it's not the case that the player is just treating it like a video game without any care for repercussions or consequences, and they're just like, I want to see what happens when I do this, and I want to see what happens when I do that. Oh, look, the prince. Let me see if I can shoot the prince with a bow gun. You know, it's like, no, we're all working together to create a story, and so if what the players want to do deviates from what I expect, that's part of the game. That's part of being a good game master. You figure it out, and you improv on the fly, and hopefully the stuff that you prepared beforehand can still be used in some other way. But when the players just shirk their side of the bargain, and they're not playing the same game as you anymore, then screw that player. You know, that's not the game. Now, that's okay. There's other kinds of games besides D&D 5th edition. There's so many games. There's thousands of games. I don't know them all. Off the top of my head, we have every edition of D&D, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, plus all the halves and the E's. There's old school essentials, Dungeon Crawl, classics, Stars Without Number, Call of Cthulhu. A new one came out that's like Renaissance themed. I saw a few where you play as like mice or goblins, something like Taskmaster. GURPS, Starfinder, Pathfinder, Star Wars the role-playing game, Pokemon the role-playing game, Harry Potter the role-playing game, Dark Souls the role-playing game. Like, there's so many tabletop role-playing games. You don't have to play D&D 5e, where it's generally assumed that you're a heroic do-gooder to some degree. I mean, not everyone's a paladin, and you can be a sneaky rogue, but if you're a sneaky rogue, then you should probably have in your character background that maybe you're like doing these things for a reason. Maybe you're not a generally good do-gooder two-shoes, but maybe you're being compelled to. The end result is the same. The players don't just indiscriminately attack the NPCs that the DM went out of their way to make with no reason whatsoever. And if I had players do that a lot, I would just say, you're not my player anymore, you're out, or like, we're gonna play a different game, right? So there's tabletop role-playing games, and then let's say you just want to treat things like a video game, and you don't want to role play, and you just want to hack and slash and fire missiles and laser guns and explode planets and unleash hordes of alien monsters and I don't know, whatever, right? Well, there's this thing called tabletop war gaming, not role play, not tabletop role play game. There's tabletop war games. There's war gaming. And there's gaming, and there's just role playing. There's so many different kinds of games that exist. And I'm not even talking about board games, which everyone knows what a board game is, right? No, I'm talking about a niche tabletop role-playing game. These are niche. If you just go out into everyday life, TTRPGs, D&D, it's pretty geeky and nerdy. If you didn't get the message, it's pretty niche. But even so, there's still thousands of games. And so when your players don't treat your game with some amount of respect, shut it down. Don't just stand for it. Shut it down. You're supposed to have fun too. The game is supposed to be probably the most fun for the DM. Otherwise, why are you doing all this work? All right, so in conclusion, here's how I'm going to handle the situation. I'm just going to help the player come up with a background for their character so that their character has an actual role in the world. There's a reason why dungeon masters ask for your backstory. They need to tie your character to the world. And don't let your player just say, "Oh yeah, I'm a charlatan. That's my whole backstory. I'm a charlatan." No, that's a mechanic of the player's handbook where when you create your character during the character creation process, it says choose a background, and you flip to the page and you say, "Oh, charlatan. Okay, I'm a charlatan." No, you have to do more than that. I mean, if you're showing up to some random table that you've never played at before, and the expectation is that, you're in and then you're out and that's it, then no, you don't need to prepare a backstory. But if you're going to be creating a game with your friends over months of time with a consistent story, with players that people care about, then you should put a modicum of effort into coming up with some sort of idea about who your character is, not just flipping through the backgrounds section of the player's handbook and saying, "Oh yeah, my character's an acolyte. That's my background." What is the game master supposed to do with that? And yes, I know, a perfect game master would probably be able to do a lot with that. And when my player told me, "Oh, my background is so-and-so," I'm like, all right. Oh, okay. It's all about expectations, right? My expectation was this. The player's expectation was that. You bridge the gap. You make the ends meet that weren't meeting before, and everything's fine. So, the reason why I didn't have a good time was because I thought something was going on. The other player thought something else was going on. How do you fix it? You just get everyone on the same page. So, I talked to the player and I said, "Okay, so your character's an outlander, right? Well, could you tell me a little bit about that?" And obviously, at least from my point of view, from the conversation that I had, this player doesn't really care. But for me as the game master, it means a lot to me because I need to make a story. I want to make a story for the kind of game that I want to run. So I just spoon-fed them a story. I'm like, all right, so your character's an outlander, right? Wouldn't they care about kids getting killed? And, the player says no. And I say, well, why is that? And the player says, well, I don't know, maybe my character had a bad time when they were a kid or something. Or, okay, why is your character always trying to get high? Oh, my character, bad times. So basically we said, oh, okay, I get it. So your character is basically like a functioning alcoholic who's trying to escape a bad past. And the player says, oh, yeah, that. It's like, right, that. Yup. But that's great, though. That's actually good. Because now we have an actual background for the character that the dungeon master can work with, right? If the player tells me, oh, yeah, I'm basically playing Jessica Jones, then now I have a whole lot to work with. I can say, oh, yeah, this player did love once. This character did care about things once, but then so many bad things happened to this character and traumatized this character, and that's why this character is always drinking alcohol to escape their past. And, if they could just somehow get through all that trauma and those bad things that happened to them, then they could open their hearts up again to the world, and they would care, and they would save those dying kids. But right now, this character is just so wrapped up in their own personal turmoil and tribulations and problems that they don't have the capacity to care about the world around them. And you see, all of that is so much better than just saying, yeah, my character is a charlatan. My character is an acolyte. So, players, if you're gonna play a tabletop role-playing game, you should ask the game master what the expectation is. Are you going to be creating a nice epic fantasy story together? Or are you just gonna delve into some crypt with a 50-50 chance of dying within the first 3 hours, and you should probably come with 4 different characters ready to go because the first 2 are gonna die before the session's over, right? Setting expectations, meeting expectations. That's kind of what I wanted to talk about. In the future, I'd like to make some more videos about things I've learned about dungeon mastering. Pretty much none of it is original. It's all just stuff that I've learned from other people on YouTube and blog posts and forums. But this is my channel where I like to talk about things in my life, so it's okay if it's not original. And I actually do have something that I know is original that I am eventually going to make a video about. An intersection between my hobby of tabletop role-playing games, dungeon mastering for tabletop role-playing games, creative writing, and software engineering, and note-keeping. Yes, I somehow came up with a system, an idea that I can implement in code that somehow ties together all of those things I just talked about. And I haven't seen anyone do it. And I don't think I can make money off of it. So I'm going to do it for myself. I've already done rudimentary versions for myself, but they're very rudimentary. And they do what they're supposed to, but it's a pain in the butt to use it because it's rudimentary. So I've recently learned some new techniques, and I'm going to basically make like a 2.0 version of this system that I came up with. I'm going to write up all the code for it because I'm a software engineer, so writing code is not that hard. And once I have it working, I'd like to make a video about that, basically showing off what the code can do for you as a dungeon master who's creating a story with clues and scenes and segues and NPCs and organizations and all that stuff. So yeah, that's I think this is probably my first video talking about Dungeons and Dragons on my YouTube channel. But yeah, it's a hobby that I'm very into, so probably some more in the future. Thanks for listening.